tenant questions regarding the presentation, or more specifically, anything other than that is related to the current market, we'd certainly welcome your questions. So I guess we have a Q&A box here at the bottom of your screen. And so if you have questions, simply type in the question, and then we will make sure that that gets addressed during the webinar today. Thank you.
Thank you, Alex, for that. So we wanted to do something for our landlord clients because time and time again, we've been encountering some of the challenges that they've been facing. Mainly, obviously, as you know, after COVID, the rental market took a dive in terms of the number of vacancies that popped up. And as a result, the rental prices have gone down approximately 20% in the downtown core, not as drastic in the outskirts or in the GTA. And even Midtown and North York didn't really suffer as much as the downtown core. And the downtown core really took a beating because all the office buildings were closed, retail, restaurants, all of the people who normally would be renting in those areas, it became a bit of a ghost town. And then as a result of, when prices started going down, people were moving because they were getting a better deal elsewhere. They could upsize into a larger unit for the same amount that they were paying, or now they could include parking, or sometimes people were not comfortable living in a condo situation during COVID and in close quarters and having to share elevators and whatnot. And sometimes roommates decided to part ways, and other people who have lost their jobs maybe could no longer afford rent and went back to live with family or whatnot temporarily. So these are all the reasons why. Oh, and also immigration, international students were not around anymore. So those are some of the reasons why there created a huge number of vacancies, which then put downward pressure on the price. Things have improved a little bit. Things are not taking as long to rent. You have to be aggressive with your pricing sometimes in order to attract tenants. But certainly things are improving. We're probably not going to see rental prices improve to the level that they were at in 2019 until maybe next year. But slowly and surely they are going to improve. So some of the issues that we've been hearing about with our landlords are, number one, like obviously there's a lot more I guess moving. Tenants are giving notice and moving more frequently. They maybe would have stayed for longer, but if they see a better deal elsewhere, they may decide to move. Some tenants left because the condo market, as investors were leaving the condo market last year, some first-time home buyers jumped at the opportunity to buy something, so that's why they left. So there's, people are leaving more frequently, and then as landlords have to re-rent, they're re-renting at a much lower price. Or tenants wish to stay, but kind of try to negotiate down the rent, and in order to stay. That's kind of the carrot that they're dangling. And so our landlords are having to figure out how to make that work. There's also many landlords that allowed a deferment of rent and now are having a hard time collecting that. And then now this year, there's no rental increase allowed at all, which is posing some problems for our clients. So one of the main problems that we're seeing is our clients' ability to sell a tenanted property. And some of them want to cash out because prices are still very good, but it's posing to be a problem for many reasons. And that's why we've asked Bita Di Lisi of Stonegate Legal Services to come. Bita was a real estate broker. She's no longer practicing because her paralegal business has been keeping her super busy. And so she has been counseling and offering services to support landlords for many years now. And so she's going to go through a presentation that basically highlights a lot of the issues that are happening in today's market, how to overcome some of these challenges, and then we're going to open it up to Q&A after. Okay, so with that being said, Bita, take it away.
Thank you, Elaine. Thank you, Alex. Thank you so much, everyone, for waking up early on a Saturday morning to join us on today's presentation. Elaine, you still can't see me though. Is that okay? Oh, you're on mute.
Bita, that's totally okay. We don't need to see you, but maybe after when we're doing the Q&A, it would be great to see you, and we can, but yeah, feel free to run through the presentation.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. So let's get started. Again, for those of you who don't know me, my name is Bita Di Lisi. My background lies in real estate. If you haven't already done so, I encourage you to head over to our social media, like us, follow us on Facebook and Instagram. I'm always keeping you updated and giving away my my stuff for free. So head over to our social media, definitely follow us and like us. If you ever come across a matter, or if you ever have a question that you require clarity, I'm very responsive. Email is the best way to get a hold of me, and my information is below. So let's get started. I will tell you a little bit about myself. As Elaine mentioned, my background does lie in real estate. I got my real estate license back in 2004, 2005, and then I started acquiring landlord and investor clients who purchased, small to medium-sized apartment buildings and commercial plazas, but they weren't in the province or in the country to take care of these investments. And like every other realtor, I want to keep that relationship going. So what I did is I offered to manage these properties, and alongside my husband, we started a property management company. And through the property management company, I would actually end up in the landlord and tenant board, representing my out of province and out of country landlords on matters such as, pertaining to non-payment of rent, illegal activities, persistent late payment of rent, damages, so forth and so on. And 9 times out of 10, my matters would get dismissed because I was not a licensed paralegal or a lawyer. So because I love school so much, I went back to school, I obtained my paralegal license. Again, I obtained my license so that I can provide a better service to my clients. And then what happened was I started getting, investors, realtors, brokerages, managers approaching me, asking me to hold seminars, educational seminars, so that I can provide support to landlords and investors and their realtors. So this is all my firm does. All we do is real estate matters with respect to landlord and tenancies. For the purpose of this presentation, now that you know a little bit of background about me, everything we discuss is for general information only. Nothing is to be taken as legal advice. Again, if you have a question, I encourage you to hold it to the very end where we can hold a Q&A, or if you have a private matter, feel free to send me an email or give me a call. So let's get started. So I get asked questions, more questions commonly than others, and I've narrowed it down. These are the 3 top questions that I get approached by realtors asking, before listing a property for sale, asking on behalf of their landlords and their clients. Sometimes they call me and say, "Hey, Bita, can we evict the tenant to sell a property?" Or, "Hey, Bita, the tenant isn't allowing for showings. Can we kick them out?" Or, "The landlord's lease is coming to an end. Can we give the tenant notice to move out?" And the hard answer to all these 3 questions is no. So no, you can't evict a tenant to sell a property. No, you can't kick a tenant out because the tenant isn't allowing for showings. And no, you can't give a tenant notice to move out because the lease is coming to an end. And the reason the answer is no is because tenants have what we call security of tenure. And what that means is that just because their lease term is coming to the end doesn't mean that they have to move out. A tenant is entitled to occupy the property after the lease comes to the end of its term. Okay, just the relationship changes from a fixed term tenancy, which is a 1-year tenancy to a month-to-month tenancy. You see, a tenancy can be terminated only in one of three ways. Number one, if the tenant decides to leave and gives notice, that's by way of an N9. Number two, if the landlord and tenant mutually agree to terminate tenancy, that's by way of an N11. Or number three, by way of a board or court order. None of which, implies that because the lease is coming to the end of its term, or because the tenant is not allowing for showings, or because the landlord and tenant don't get along. These reasons are not cause to end the tenancy. So more often than not, I get landlords, calling me and saying, I have a tenant that, is residing in my property. I want to sell the property. How do I sell the property, or how do I get the tenant to cooperate during COVID? Well, off the bat, as I'm sure you already know, these uncertain times are challenging for everyone. Landlords, investors, realtors, everyone is affected by COVID. There's not one person out there that COVID has not affected, good or bad. However, I always recommend to the landlord, if you're going to be putting a property for sale, hire a realtor, hire a pro. Okay, never ever do something that you're not familiar with the process. Go to a pro, hire a realtor. And I always tell my realtors is, whenever you're taking on a listing, always encourage your client to hire a legal representative to represent them. And for landlord and tenant matters, I always recommend hiring a paralegal, because paralegals are often well-versed with the Residential Tenancies Act. A lot of people think that lawyers, the real estate lawyers, are well-versed with the act. And that's not correct. Real estate lawyers know real estate law. Paralegals usually practice in the Landlord and Tenant Board, the tribunal. So they will be able to assist you with this process. That legal representative will provide notice to the tenant to inform them of the intention of the landlord. Proper notice is always recommended to be given to the tenant for showings. Remember, we want the tenant to cooperate, so we don't want to surprise them or bombard them with showings, okay? Number four, COVID safety packages are placed on the property, which usually include hand sanitizers, masks, gloves, shoe or foot coverings. 99% of realtors have been doing this already. So this gives a peace of mind to the tenants that whoever's coming into the property is taking the appropriate safety measures to keep everyone safe. Remember, safety first, right? Or the alternative, because you do come across that one tenant that says, I have an underlying condition, or I don't have good lungs. Although I want to cooperate, I don't want the foot traffic to come in so excessively. And again, a lot of what realtors have been doing for the alternative is putting together a virtual video tour or pictures. And then upon a conditional agreement of purchase and sale, obviously conditional upon the new purchaser's viewing of the property, the tenant will usually accommodate. Again, we want to be courteous to the tenant. Remember, the board, the landlord and tenant board, for those of you who don't have the experience in dealing with the board is very tenant friendly. Okay, they see the landlord as purchasing property for the purpose of an investment to make money, whereas the tenant is residing in the property for housing. Okay, so again, we want to be courteous to the tenant. At the end of the day, you have a goal in mind. The bigger goal is to sell the property. You need that tenant to cooperate. So let's say, for example, we got that tenant to cooperate. We received an agreement of purchase and sale. They removed the conditions, and now you have a firm offer and you wait for closing. So let's talk about vacant possession. Off the bat, before we even move forward, what you have to know is that there is no such thing as a guarantee to vacant possession. And anyone that tells you there is, tell them to call me, because I'm open to learning how they can guarantee vacant possession, because we definitely can't. What you have to know is you have to know what your options are, okay? Option number one is what we call the N12. We're going to go by way of an N12. And we're going to explain to you the N12. And then I'm going to get into option number two, which is the more effective option, and it's called cash for keys. Let's talk about option number one, okay? This is why I'm telling you that off the bat, your realtor cannot serve the N12 or any N form. If your realtor does, they are actually breaching the Law Society rules and providing legal services. And what you're risking is that your application or your hearing will get dismissed at the board. So remember, you're hiring your realtor to sell the property. This is where their expertise lies in. Do not roll the dice to save money. Do not jump over the dollar to pick up the nickel. Hire a legal representative to do this for you, okay? So this is what the N12 looks like. The left is a screenshot of the first page. The right side is a screenshot of the second page. So you're probably looking at this and saying, how difficult is this? Why do I even need to hire a legal representative to fill this out? Well, we're going to get into that. The reason I recommend that you hire someone, a pro, to do this is because you don't know what the consequences or the requirements are that come with this notice. Okay, a notice is not just a notice. When you're trying to get a tenant to move out, you have to go through the board. Remember, this is just a notice. There is no enforcement behind it. Basically, what this notice says is that Mr. or Mrs. Tenant, we're going to have the purchaser move into the property because we've sold the property, and you have 60 days to move out. But now the clock starts because now you have to fulfill the requirements. No different than an agreement of purchase and sale. When you put an offer in conditional on financing and home inspection, you have to fulfill the requirements or the conditions. No different than that. So the N12 has certain conditions. Let's talk about that. But first, let's talk about why you would use an N12. So the only time you would serve an N12 is for two reasons. If the landlord requires the property for their own use, the use of their immediate family, being their child or parent, or their caregiver. Whomever is moving into the property is to occupy the property for residential purposes for at least 1 year. Okay, these are the requirements for the landlord's own use. For the purpose of this presentation, we're going to discuss for the purchaser's own use. Okay, the requirements of using an N12 for the purchaser's own use is that the N12 must only be served upon a firm agreement of purchase and sale. So requirement number one is that the agreement of purchase and sale has to be firm and not conditional. Number two, the property must contain 3 units or less. Okay, if you have a fourplex and you want to kick the tenants out and move in, you can't use the N12. That's a requirement. Number three, if the purchaser's immediate family member, parent, or child, or caregiver require the property for residential purposes for at least 1 year. Okay, so here's a consequence. A landlord cannot issue a notice if the landlord is a corporation. So if, let's say, for example, Alex owns a condo and Alex is selling this condo and Elaine is going to be moving in, and Elaine has a corporation and she wants to purchase this condo under her corporation number 1234 Ontario Inc. And in her agreement of purchase and sale, she says, I'm going to be moving in. Well, Alex, who's the current seller landlord, cannot issue an N12 for Elaine to move in because the new landlord or Elaine is purchasing under a corporation, and a corporation is deemed to be a separate entity. It's a company. How can a company personally occupy a property? You can't. So again, this is one of the things, one of the consequences that I said. Also, you can't serve an N12 for members of their extended family, brother, sister, aunt, uncle, niece, cousin. You can't serve an N12. This is why I always say, hire a pro. Don't get your realtor entangled in serving legal notices. Let's move on. Let's talk about good faith, because like any legal notice, the N12 has a huge good faith factor attached to it. So what is good faith? Good faith is having the genuine intent to occupy the property for residential purposes. You cannot serve an N12 because your tenant, you're experiencing problems with that tenant. So if your tenant is blocked you from WhatsApp or WeChat or Facebook, or they're not answering your email, or they blocked you on Messenger, you cannot use the N12 as a loophole in order to end the tenancy. Why? Because a tenant has rights. And for those of you who are familiar with tenants' rights, one of the tenant's rights is that a tenant can file a T5 bad faith application against a former landlord for bad faith within 12 months of the date that they moved out. So this is not something with a limitation period of 30 days. And if they miss the 30 days, then they can't do it. No, no, no. This has a limitation period of 12 months. All it takes is for the tenant, Alex, to start talking at a cocktail party and people start opening their mouths and, he's informed of the landlord and tenant board. Like, he's got 12 months to put an application together. So keep that in mind. Once you or your legal rep have drafted the N12, how do you serve tenants? Let's talk about service. One thing I really love about the real estate industry, I have to say, is that the real estate industry has evolved with technology. So what does that mean? That means that realtors are using their phones to take pictures and emails. They're sending offers via DocuSign for signatures. You don't even have to be, you don't even have to have access to a printer anymore, or even be in the same country. You can buy a house from anywhere in the world by using your iPhone or your smartphone. Well, the wheels of justice spin very, very slowly. And what that means is that landlords must serve their tenants in accordance with the rules of procedure of the Landlord and Tenant Board. And the rules of procedure state that a landlord may only serve their tenants in one of the following ways: by handing the document to the tenant in person, by handing it to another adult in the rental unit, placing it in the tenant's mailbox or where mail is usually delivered, sliding the document under the door or through a mail slot, faxing it to the tenant's place of business or residence, by courier, registered mail, or express post. Here's a consequence or requirement. If you're serving a document via mail or registered mail, you must add additional days to the termination date. Remember, any errors in the application, you are risking the application and getting dismissed. Let's talk about the test of bad faith. So I have a story. Let me start off by telling you a story. I had a client who resided in Nigeria, and she owned a 2-bedroom condo down in King Street in Toronto. And her daughter attended the University of Ottawa. So this landlord phoned me all the way from Nigeria, and she said, "Bita, I served an N12 notice to my tenants because my daughter said that she wants to move to Toronto and experience living and working in the downtown core. So I served the N12, the tenants moved out, and I received a notice of a hearing. And I'm not quite sure why." And I said to her, "Well, did your daughter move in?" And she said, "No." And I said, "Well, why didn't your daughter move in?" And she said, "Well, life changed and she decided to pursue her education in UK at the University of Oxford." And I said, "Well, when we go to the board, there's a test of bad faith. There's a test to bad faith. And this test is, it's compiled of three questions. 3 questions the adjudicator will ask you. And I'll tell you, bad faith applications, 99.9% of the time, there is no defense to it, no matter what excuse you use. Okay, so the adjudicator asks 3 things. Okay, so number 1, they ask, did the tenant rely on the N12 in order to move out of the property? Number 2, is there an advertisement of the rental property? And number 3, did the person who was supposed to move into the unit actually move in? So these are the 3 things I asked my client. I said, the tenants, well, they relied on the N12 in order to move out because they moved out. You went ahead and you listed the property on the MLS for lease at $500 or $600 more a month. So now they have access to an advertisement. And number 3, the person who was supposed to move into the unit did not move in. Total bad faith. And when we went to the board, as much as we defended the application, unfortunately, she failed the test of bad faith miserably. And the adjudicator actually ordered her to pay $14,000 to the tenants. So again, N12 should not be served in bad faith. So what are other remedies that the board can order on a bad faith application to the tenant? So other remedies are a rent abatement, the difference in rent between the former unit and the new unit, an order to pay a fine into the board, moving costs, basically any out-of-pocket expenses that the tenant has incurred, now up to 50,000. So that 35,000 has been increased to 50 now. And basically any other order that the board finds appropriate. Let's talk about other requirements of the N12, okay? And when I refer to other requirements, I'm referring to compensation. So Section 48 of the Residential Tenancies Act states that compensation must be paid on or before the termination date in the amount of 1 month's rent, okay? Even if the tenants don't move out. And we're going to talk about the tenants not moving out. A declaration or affidavit must be submitted to the board, which I've always done in my business. And now, per the new Bill 184, landlords must disclose in their affidavit or declaration of any previous notices of termination served to the tenant. So basically what your history of service of notices are. So let's talk about the tenants not moving out, because earlier in my presentation, I mentioned that the N12 notice is just a notice. It doesn't have enforcement behind it until it goes through the motions of the board and you obtain an order. You see, that's a screenshot of the second page of the N12. And if you look at the third bolded box from the left down, it's telling the tenant, what if you disagree with this notice? And if you look to the right, it says, if you disagree with this notice, you do not have to move out of the rental unit. So if the tenant actually wishes to dispute this notice, they are not obligated to move out of the rental unit. It doesn't matter if you sold the property or not. The sale of the property is not relevant to their tenancy. So the tenant can actually remain in the unit and challenge the N12 until a hearing date is set. However, if your tenant decides to leave earlier than the 60 days, as indicated in the N12, compensation still must be paid, and any monies that the landlord holds must be returned. Let's talk about the hearing. So how do you file for a hearing? The N12 must be filed with the board once served on the tenant. This is very important. Whether or not you have to get to that hearing, if the tenant leaves on their own, what is it you've lost? You've lost a couple $100 in the filing fee. But if the tenant doesn't leave, you have to proceed in order to get a hearing date. The certificate of service or proof of service on who served the document. Remember, this is why we don't want the realtor involved, because the realtor and the property manager are not, the board is not very realtor and property manager friendly, is what I want to say. Okay, so you don't want to get them involved. The landlord or legal rep must provide documentation to support the N12, such as an agreement of purchase and sale, a doctor's note if the caregiver is required, affidavits or declaration, basically any other documents requested by the board. This is very important because remember, you have to fulfill requirements. How do you cancel the N12? So the story I gave about my client in Nigeria, and I do understand, I get it. Life changes. Nobody knows what's going to happen in the next few months, especially with the delays being so extensive. Who knows what's going to happen in the next 9 months? However, there is no set way to cancel or redact an N12 once it's served to the tenant. Landlords must make certain that whomever is going to be moving in is 100% committed before serving to the tenant. Because once you serve that notice, you serve it. So excuses such as my daughter changed their mind, or they had a baby and the property is now too small for them to move into, these don't fly with the board. Okay, especially when the tenant relies on that notice, has committed to another lease, and has moved out. If, for example, whoever is going to be moving in doesn't move in, you should inform the tenant in writing and hope that the tenant does not bring an application on bad faith against you. Again, for up to 50,000, not 35. That 35 has been increased. Let's talk about errors, okay? Because errors are very important. You know, unlike the agreement of purchase and sale, where if there are any errors or if there are any changes, there can be amendments. You cannot amend a notice once it's been served. You have to start the process all over again. So all legal services all legal notices must be free from errors, no matter how minor. If there's an error in the name, the date, the address, the calculation, the certificate of service, that application will be dismissed. That is a guarantee I can make. Okay. So remember, don't do it yourself. Please don't hire your realtor to do it, because you're only entangling them or asking them to do something that they're not licensed or insured for. And this is what the consequence, okay? If you or your property manager or your realtor does it. Let's talk about the delays, okay? Because the delays are parallel to the consequence. So pre-COVID, it took about 4 or 5 months to get a hearing date at the board. The board shut down on March 16, 2020, and they stopped hearing in-person applications with respect to evictions, mainly landlord applications. They reopened on August 1st, although they're not holding in-person hearings. Video and telephone hearings are still going on. Now, because of the stay-at-home order, there is a ban on evictions. And what that means is that hearings are still going on, but those landlords who've received an order of enforcement in hand for whatever reason, when they go and file it with the sheriff's office, the sheriff cannot physically remove the tenant and evict them because of the stay-at-home order. So when that stay-at-home order is lifted on May 20th, then the sheriff will resume evictions. Currently, it's taking an average time of about 9 to 12 months in order to work through all that backlog. So what that means is that this is going to impact your closing date. Your closing date needs to have specific Schedule A's in there, which I can send over to Elaine. And that if you are selling a property, you can have your realtor put that in just to protect yourselves. Because if you're not able to provide vacant possession, like your offer is asking you to, then you're going to be held accountable and you're going to have to pay a penalty per month to the buyer to stick around until you are able to provide vacant possession. So you're probably thinking, what's the alternative? And the alternative is what I call a cash for keys. And a cash for keys is exactly what I call it. It's off the top. Let's make this clear. It is not extortion. Okay. People say, well, it's extortion. No, it's not. It's called business. And as a landlord, you took the risk on purchasing rental property. And one of the risks is that you're dealing with tenants that are not very cooperative or very challenging. So you have to do what you have to do in order to get them out and provide vacant possession. Sometimes cash for keys is the only option that a landlord has. Okay. For example, if you have a fourplex, you can't serve it N12. You can't get the tenant out any other way. Let's talk about cash for keys. And a cash for keys is exactly what I call it. We would offer an enticing offer to the tenant. It doesn't have to be cash. It can be whatever. Okay, so it could be cash. It could be a forgiveness of the rent arrears if they owe rent monies. It could be paying for their moving costs or storage fees, something of value in order to facilitate a termination of tenancy with that tenant. Your legal representative will negotiate the terms directly with that tenant and will draft a consent agreement and an N11 agreement to mutually end the tenancy. The N11 agreement to end the tenancy is a very powerful agreement. And I call it the Incredible Hulk because at the time that it's signed, all parties are agreeing to end the tenancy. And this is the strategy. Okay, I'm very strategic when it comes to termination of tenancies. When all parties agree to the consent agreement and the N11, I file it immediately with the board. And then I request an ex parte order. And an ex parte order is an immediate order without a hearing to evict that tenant if the tenant changes their mind and doesn't leave. I have to let you know that 9 times out of 10, the tenant will leave. Cash for keys is very, very effective. However, you do have that 1% because, again, nothing is guaranteed that the tenant doesn't leave. A cash for keys, the timing on a cash for keys is anywhere from 30, 60 to 90 days to receive the board order. Right now, the board is working very effectively. So for the cash for keys that we've done in the month of April alone, I would say we've done anywhere from about 50 to 60 cash for keys. And the timing to receive the ex parte order is about 2 weeks. So the board is spinning them out really quickly. And the legal rep will arrange for the keys to be picked up. So I'm going to be sending this presentation to Elaine. Elaine, feel free to send it over to everyone so that they can refer to it in their business. So now we're getting close to the end of the presentation. Again, all my giveaways is free. I give all my stuff away for free. I've come across with my husband, we've put together what we call the Landlord Mastery Guide. And this is a guide that we use to own and operate our own rental properties. It gives you access to our Google Drive, which is packed with forms, other agreements such as the parking agreement or an air conditioning agreement, a legal notice of entry, which you can print and just fill in the blanks. Basically, it's a guide to assist you in your business in being a landlord, because it is a business. You're not just purchasing property and expect to be hands off. Those days are over. The tenants are very savvy with the use of the internet and access to free duty counsel, free legal advice, the landlord and tenant board. You have to arm yourself. Knowledge is power. So this is our free guide. Head over to landlordmastery.ca and Elaine will send you a copy of that agreement, the guide. We have come to the end of the presentation. Thank you so much for being patient, and I will turn it to you, Elaine and Alex, for a Q&A.
Okay, Bita, I think it shows me that your camera is not turned on. So is that something that you can turn on your end?
It still says you can't start your video because the host has stopped it.
Okay, maybe I'll keep playing with that then.
Sure.
But in the meantime, I do have a number of questions, and I have a comment as well, in terms of the N12 bad faith. It's not just for selling, it's also for, as prices improve on the market, I'm sure that some landlords will try to, let's say, get their tenant out so that when they re-rent it, especially if there's no rental increases allowed this year, and who knows what it's going to be next year, try to re-rent it at a higher price, right? So, or maybe they'll want to try to kick the tenant out by saying, oh, my son is moving in, and then renovate the unit and then put it back on the market for a higher price, right? So this bad faith applies to all of that as well.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Stay away from bad faith. I'm telling you from my experience, it's really, really not worth it. Just stay away from bad faith. If you want to terminate tenancy, contact me. I will assist you in how to legally end the tenancy. If you have to do a cash for keys, it's a write-off. The cash for keys is a write-off, a tax write-off. It is what it is. It saves you $50,000. Do not roll the dice when it comes to terminating tenancy. You have to have cause.
Right. Okay, so I just wanted to, Alex, I don't know if you have any comments.
Yeah, that was an amazing presentation, Bita. Thank you so much. I think all of us learned a lot. That was really helpful, very timely, as I mentioned earlier, in terms of what we're dealing with right now with COVID. So thank you for that. We do have a series of questions, and I want to I'm just going to read them here, if that's okay.
Absolutely.
I know you touched on this earlier. I'm just going to read it. It says, if I'm selling my tenanted property and 24 hours notice is provided to the tenant, I guess for viewing, can the tenant still refuse viewings? What recourse do I have as a landlord if they refuse?
So, in accordance to the Act, the tenant cannot refuse viewings, okay? However, a landlord cannot enforce entry. So by the time the landlord serves an N5 notice for interference, so the tenant is interfering with the lawful rights of showing the property, and files that with the board and plays the waiting game, it's going to take months in order to get an order to comply. Okay, and I'm talking about 9, 10, 11 months. And that landlord has already missed the market. Okay, usually when a tenant refuses showings is because the relationship has gone sour. What I'm recommending to my landlords is again, the reason why you should hire a third party is so that that third party can inform the tenant or find out what it is they're looking for in order to cooperate. So I'll tell you, Alex, some of my landlords have paid for the tenants to go away on a weekend to a spa up north, or go away to a hotel for a week so that they can show the property while the tenant is not there. and they pay for it, meals, accommodations, just for a week or a weekend, so that they can have that activity going into the property. These are some of the ways that, some of the things you can present to your tenant or have the third party present to the tenant in order to get them to cooperate. And this is what we've been finding very effective.
That's great advice. Thank you.
Oh, there you are. Okay.
There I am.
Now we can
Sorry.
see you.
Excellent.
Okay, there's another question here, not related to your presentation. Rental reductions. Because of COVID, my tenant is asking for a rental reduction. Am I able to give them a temporary rental rebate, i.e. 6 to 12 months, and then raise the rent, or then the rent goes back to what it was prior to COVID?
So Alex, this is actually a great question. Rent rebates, let's talk about that. How does a company do a rebate? So you'd purchase a product, you would pay in full, and you would send the stub back to the company. The company would issue you, I don't know, $3, $5, whatever that rebate is. No different than the rent. If you're going to do a temporary rebate, your tenant should be paying the full rent. So let's say, for example, Elaine says, I'm going to give my tenant Alex a 20% rebate. So Alex would pay his $1,000 a month like he normally does. And then Elaine, upon receipt of that money, she would rebate him back 20% for X amount of months. The rent has to be paid in full. And let me tell you why, because in the event that Elaine wants to increase the rent next year, if you reduce the rent on paper and Alex starts paying a 20% reduction instead of the full rent and have his rent rebated, then legally, Elaine has agreed to lawfully reducing lawful rent, the full rent, which means that the rent increase is only applicable on the deducted rent and not on the full rent, which we want to protect the full rent so that if she wants to increase the rent amount, it's on the $1,000 and not on the 20% reduction. Does that make sense?
So then the landlord would then, so if I just understand correctly, so there has to be an exchange of an actual rebate that happens, right? And it has to be done on paper. It can't just be like, this is temporary. And then, because you're right, then it becomes like a legal contract where you're actually making that payment for the reduced payment for that year. So therefore that becomes the new base rent or whatever you want to call it. Okay.
You got it.
Okay.
Okay, I have a couple of questions that were emailed in. So one of our clients lives in a property where they rent out the basement, and their basement tenant has had guests over regardless of the lockdown and whatnot. They've contacted bylaw officers and whatnot, and still their tenant is having gatherings. Is that a reason to terminate the tenancy?
No. COVID is not a reason in the act to end the tenancy.
Okay, so there's nothing that they can do about that, even though they are being put at risk because there's people on their property.
Well, are they really being put at risk if the tenant is in a separate dwelling? I mean, if bylaw is being called, bylaw will send an officer out and they will, assess the situation and they will issue a fine or a warning, but it is not a reason to end the tenancy.
Okay. And then because of COVID, as tenants may lose their job, start a job, or maybe have reduced hours as, lockdown orders are lifted or placed or whatnot. What happens if they are unable to pay the rent?
So notices can still be served. And I've always encouraged the landlords to serve notices. You have to serve your notices. You have to have a paper trail, COVID or no COVID, this is procedure. However, physically evicting them is a process. Getting to that process is timely. And when stay-at-home orders are ordered, The sheriff's office, the enforcement office, they temporarily put a ban on enforcement of evictions. But starting a process, going through the board, playing the waiting game to get a hearing, definitely that process should be started because it's a lengthy process.
Right. Okay. So even if the payment is late, you'd still file the notice on the first day that it's late, even if it comes in later on that month. You should
That's right.
still make a habit of filing the notice every time.
Well, you don't have to file the notice every time, okay? You serve the N4,
Yes.
okay? And then you would file it. And if the tenant is late moving forward, then on the day of the hearing, there is an update sheet that you can update the board on how much arrears are owed from the time that you filed the application. So you don't have to file and serve and file multiple non-payment of rent notices.
Okay. And then going back to the rent rebate, if you do offer a rebate and there is a discount to what they were paying, is that somehow tax deductible?
I'm pretty sure it is, but don't quote me. Talk to your accountant.
Okay.
I have a question that was emailed in. The situation is as follows. So owner lives upstairs, rents out the basement unit. It's a 1-bedroom basement unit. Call it 600 square feet. Self-contained unit inside the basement. The rental application stated it was going to be one. This gentleman, the tenant, is the only occupant listed on the rental agreement and also on the rental application. Is there a rule or a law that states that the tenant is allowed to bring in temporary occupants through the course of their tenancy, to which point it becomes unsafe? So this situation, this tenant would have multiple guests at a time, 3, 4, sometimes 6, and they would stay for an extended period of time. And so the landlord would like to know, is that behavior, is that grounds for termination of the rental agreement?
So only if it's contrary to the occupancy limit, that landlord is going to have to look into their municipality, what their bylaw limits allow per square footage. And then they would serve a notice to the tenant for overcrowding.
Okay.
That notice, it tells the tenant that you have 7 days to get rid of X number of people, or I can file to the board. But a landlord cannot dictate whether or not the tenant brings in guests and how long their guests stay.
Okay.
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 Bita, what are the options for landlords if a tenant wants to break a lease in the middle of the initial lease term?
Okay, so let's talk about breaking a lease. A lease is a contract, okay? It's the rules of the game. However, I mean, people break promises all the time. What can a landlord do? So if a tenant is breaking a lease and if it's not mutually agreed upon, then what happens is the landlord can only go after that tenant from the period of time that that tenant has moved out until the period of time that the new tenant has moved in. Okay, both parties, the landlord and tenant, must minimize their damages as quickly as possible, meaning that tenant has to find someone else to assign the unit to, and that landlord has to re-rent the unit as quickly as possible. Okay, the landlord cannot double dip. Any landlord that brings a fruitless claim against the tenant while they have another tenant moved in there to sue them for the balance of their lease is not going to win at the board.
Can the landlords charge the tenant for the cost of re-rental?
No. Remember, this is a business. There are a lot of landlords that really should not be landlords. And I say that strongly because they tell, and this is one of the questions they ask, well, I have to hire a realtor and I have to put it and advertise it. Well, these are the risks involved when you own rental properties. One of the risks is your tenant is going to leave. They're not going to have the perfect tenant. It does not exist. You're dealing with people. And whenever you're dealing with people in any business, things are so often challenging. So these are costs that are incurred whenever you're owning and operating your business. And again, if you're hiring a realtor to rent the property, it's a tax write-off, right?
One of the most common questions that we get is how do landlords increase the rent legally? Can you maybe talk about that process and what's involved with that?
Absolutely. So there are rules around rent increases. A landlord has to provide legal notice by way of an N form, okay, to the tenant, providing the tenant 90 days advance notice of such rent increase. And that rent increase has to be per the rent increase guideline set by the ministry. So every year there's a percentage that you can increase the rent. There is a rent freeze for 2021. We're hoping that will have some sort of a rent increase percentage for 2022. However, that is the percentage is usually made public sometime in, I would say, August, September. When it's public, what the landlord can do is serve the notice to the tenant sometime in August, giving them advance notice that your rent is increased by, I don't know, 1.5% effective January 1st, 2022. So there are rules surrounding rent increases. A landlord cannot increase the rent $200 or $300, $400 because that is now the market rent. Because at the time that they rented the property, they were asking market rent. Okay, no difference than going out and buying a house. The interest rate is low this year, but in 3 years, just because the interest rates have gone up, can the bank ask you to pay the higher interest rate if you're locked into your current interest rate? No different.
We have a great question from one of our attendees. And this is something that we do get a lot about as well. What can a landlord do if the tenants move out and cause damages to the property? What recourse does a landlord have?
Okay, so currently, with respect to damages, landlords can pursue claims against a former tenant through the small claims court for damages. There's a new Bill 184, and Bill 184, that section pertaining to damages states that a landlord can go after a former tenant for damages within 1 year from the date that tenant has moved out through the landlord and tenant board. That section of that Bill 184 has not been claimed yet. We're hoping that as soon as it is, landlords can bring claims against former tenants through the board. What you have to keep in mind, Alex, is that you still have to find that tenant in order to serve them. Okay, so if you can't find them, you can't serve them, then you can't go after them.
Great point. We do have another question as well. I know you touched on this a little bit, but I think maybe some best practices in terms of how to deal with tenants when selling a property. So to get their cooperation and to also make sure that this process is smooth and there's no issues between time of sale and closing. So maybe talk about some best practices in terms of what you recommend or what you're seeing some of your staff do in terms of making that process smooth.
Okay, so best practice off the top, anytime a landlord is trying to sell the property is step away from the property, hire a third party. It's very, very important. I know that it's an extra cost. The reason why you need to hire a third party is somebody who doesn't have an interest in the property. The realtor's interest is selling the property. And oftentimes, as good of an intention that realtor has, they really don't know how to deal with that tenant. A legal rep has no ties to the property. They're not getting a commission out of the property. Whether or not the property sells, it really doesn't matter. Their job is to facilitate a mutual termination. That's best practice number one. Best practice number two, it has to be legal. Don't do anything that is going to affect your credibility, because the last thing you need, Alex, is that tenant drawing a line in the sand and saying, you know what, I'm not going to cooperate with you. I'm not going to communicate with you. And good luck getting in here during a pandemic, because that way nobody benefits, not the seller, not the realtor, not the legal rep. Okay, definitely hire a third party, someone who has experience in dealing with termination of tenancy. Definitely do not jump over the dollar to pick up the nickel.
Yeah, no, I think, and another side question to that, I think is you're absolutely right in terms of a tenancy termination. But what about the earlier part, getting their buy-in for the actual viewing process? Like, I know you mentioned like, dropping off safety kits, with sanitizer and gloves and so forth. Any other best practices, whether that's like, I'm just throwing out an idea, giving them like a bottle of wine or some sort of token gesture to show that you appreciate, the, there being showings and so forth. Anything that you've seen that find is very effective in terms of getting tenants to buy into that process?
Well, if the landlord has the budget, send the tenant away for a weekend to Niagara Falls or somewhere. That way you have access to the property. The number one challenge that realtors and landlords are facing, Alex, is access to the property, time restrictions. Kids are home, adults are home, parents are home, everybody is home, working from home, schooling from home. So access to the property is very, very restricted or limited. If you can figure out a way to send them away for the weekend or send them away for the week so that you have access and traffic, and then tell them that while you're away, before you come back, I'm going to hire someone to professionally clean the property for you, make sure it's safe so that when you come back, it's clean. This we find has been working effectively, very, very effectively. But again, it needs to be, there's a cost to it, right?
Right.
Bita, I definitely see the value of involving someone like you in this process of selling if there's a termination involved. But what if the target buyer is another investor and the leases are being assumed? Is that still, do you still feel that it would be necessary to involve someone like you?
Absolutely, because you would involve a third party before you even list it on the market. Now, if a new purchaser is buying the property and they're an investor, it's even better, because the only change would be the documents being sent over and attached as a Schedule B or C with respect to leases, with their leases or their house rules or whatever it is. Rents cannot be increased because a new purchaser is buying the property. Okay, the new landlord cannot increase the rent. Okay, you're just like an assignment. When somebody is buying an assignment, they're buying a contract. No different than when you're assuming tenants. You're buying those lease agreements.
Okay. I think we have time for one last question, and it goes back to the bad faith N12 notice being served. Like you had mentioned, life changes, right? So even if someone's immediate family member moves in, things change and they may need to move out. So how would you, I know that you said 1 year, but how would you deal with that if they either decided to move in with a partner or they met someone and, or even those properties that you can do Airbnb on, like, would that also count as if you decided to turn around and allow for an Airbnb rental?
Yeah, you have to move in. I totally get it. Life changes. I get it. Nothing is certain, but when that notice is sent out, put yourselves in the tenant's shoes. Okay, we're in COVID. You have 2 kids, 3 kids, whatever the case is. Everybody's working from home. They're schooling from home. The property is sold. You have a tenant who's cooperated all through the course of the sale. They've been told that they have 60 days or 90 days to move per the N12. They pack up their lives. They find another rental property that's probably more money than what they're paying. And then they find an ad 2 or 3 months later that, you know, the new purchaser is re-renting for a higher price. Is that fair that that tenant had to move during a pandemic? What would you do as a tenant, right?
Well, no, I mean, obviously I would be,
Right?
I would not be happy, but I mean, I just feel, I mean, I feel for many different sides of this situation, right? Because the seller is at risk because they're responsible for what the buyer's actions are, right? So if the buyer says that they're moving in and then 6 months later you see it advertised on the MLS for renter or whatever, right? Then the seller, because the seller had given that notice, they are the ones on the hook. If the tenant turns around and says like, hey, I got kicked out of that place.
Right.
Now look, it's painted with new wood floors and now they're asking way more.
Well, this is the thing, Elaine, is that this is why I often have to give my landlords or sellers a spanking, right? When I hear this and I say, you took the risk, and I'm hard on them, I know I am. You took the risk as a seller, as an investor to purchase a property. This is the risk. Cash for keys works even better than the N12, because for cash for keys, you get the tenant out, you do what you have to do, and then you can do whatever you want to do. If your mom wants to move in, if your dad wants to move in, if you want to re-rent it at a higher price, sell it, you can do whatever you want to do with cash for keys. It's
Okay.
going to be cheaper to pay out the tenant than pray that the tenant doesn't come back for up to $50,000.
Yeah.
It's a risk, right? Welcome to real estate.
And on that note,
right, Alex?
wrap up. Thank you so much. I mean, even I learned a couple of things and tips and tricks here, so I'm sure that our clients will as well. And if you're watching on the replay and you have questions, please reach out to Alex, myself, or even Bita directly. She was more than happy to answer questions, and she's super helpful. So with that being said, I'm going to wrap up, and I will send out, or if you want to reach out, Bita's slides are available if you want to go through them. And this replay will be on our YouTube channel or our Facebook page for viewing. And make sure to follow Bita on social media.
That's right.
Thank you, Elaine. Thank you, Alex.
Thank you, Bita. That was great. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye for now. Till next
Bye-bye.
time.